Imagine for a moment trying to organize a truly massive amount of information. Maybe it's every single idea you've ever had for a book, or a sprawling presentation for work, or even just building a complex website from scratch.
Yeah, that feeling of just, where do I even start?
Exactly. It can feel like you're staring at this chaotic, overwhelming mess, right?
Totally.
But what if I told you there's an underlying system, kind of a secret language, that master designers use to bring profound order, clarity, and even beauty to that chaos?
Well, what's fascinating here is how that struggle for order isn't just about making things look nice.
Right.
It reflects a really human endeavor,
Yeah.
a deep-seated need to find meaning and make sense of the world around us. It's about making the complex digestible, transforming a jumble into something understandable.
Absolutely. And today we're embarking on a deep dive into the world of graphic design grids.
Ah, the grid.
Yeah. You might not consciously notice them, but these, like invisible structures, quietly shape almost every single thing you read, see, and interact with on a daily basis.
They really are everywhere once you start looking.
They are, in essence, the silent architects of visual communication. From ancient towns laying out their streets to the sleekest modern apps on your phone, structure seems to be this human constant.
Indeed. And we're unpacking insights today from a really incredible source, Making and Breaking the Grid, a graphic design layout workshop.
Great source.
Yeah, this book in particular offers a fantastic blend of theory, history, and really practical application. It's quite comprehensive.
So our mission in this deep dive is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge from that workshop. We want to help you understand not just what a grid is, but why it's so incredibly powerful, how it's meticulously built.
And maybe the most fun part.
Yeah.
How designers sometimes intentionally break it
Oh, yeah.
for truly stunning, sometimes even rebellious results.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
It's just captivating how the grid, in its very essence, reflects our species' ongoing struggle, really, to create understandable order in the world. It's a very human endeavor, one that spans millennia and cultures. It's not just a modern thing at all.
So let's start right at the very beginning then. When we talk about the grid in graphic design, what exactly is it? Because, for many people, it might just conjure up images of graph paper.
Right, graph paper. Yeah.
But it's far more profound than just a bunch of lines on a page.
No, it's certainly not just graph paper, although that's the visual we can relate to. Our source defines the typographic grid as a fundamental organizing principle in graphic design.
Okay.
Think of it as a distinct set of alignment-based relationships. It serves as an invisible guide, really.
An invisible guide.
Yeah, it dictates how all visual elements, whether we're talking words, images, or graphical forms, are distributed across a specific format.
So where things go.
Exactly. Their precise placement, their proportions, like height to width, and critically, how easily you, the viewer, can navigate the entire layout. It's truly a silent guide, a framework for visual logic.
And it operates with a very specific kind of logic, doesn't it? The source calls it orthogonal.
This audiobook
what does
is
that
brought
mean
to
in this
you by
context?
Sunil Sharma.
Precisely.
Dedicated
Orthogonal.
designer.
It operates on an orthogonal or 90-degree axis logic.
Okay, 90 degrees.
And this isn't an arbitrary choice. It's actually derived directly from what our source calls the fundamental verbovisual qualities of type itself.
Verbovisual. Okay, break that down.
Right. So when we say verbovisual qualities, we're talking about how the very structure of letter forms, the uprights of an I, the horizontal bar of a T, the baseline that all letters sit on,
Oh, I see.
naturally lends itself to these 90-degree angles. It's almost built into the DNA of our alphabet, making the orthogonal grid feel incredibly natural and efficient for setting text and arranging visual information. It's about precision, order, and absolute clarity.
That makes sense.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the grid isn't just about making things look neat, right? It's about making information digestible and accessible. It's almost like a visual filing cabinet for the viewer.
A filing cabinet. I like that analogy.
Intuitively where to locate information, because these horizontal and vertical divisions act as signposts. They create this kind of neutral spatial field of regularity that just it permits accessibility. It makes things easy to find.
That concept of the grid being inherently tied to the very nature of type is fascinating. But here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't some recent invention that popped up with computers or modern printing.
Not at all.
Our sources tell us the grid has deep roots, going back to the cultural practices of the oldest societies on the planet.
That's absolutely right. Structural thinking, long before it was codified into graphic design principles, was a hallmark of cultures striving towards civilization.
Wow.
We're talking about ancient societies like the Chinese, the Japanese, the Greeks, the Romans, and even the Inca.
So all over the world.
All over. They all pursued structural ideas in how they laid out their towns, how they conducted warfare, instituted religious rituals, arranged their images.
So it wasn't just about building plans.
No, it permeated everything. Often, this structure was based on the idea of intersecting axes, which could correspond to really profound concepts like the intersection of sky and earth.
Ah, okay, symbolic.
Exactly. It's this deep-seated human need for order that gives the grid an almost spiritual meaning right from its origins, connecting it to universal principles of harmony and balance.
So it's ancient, almost spiritual, and then the modernist movement comes along and really formalizes it in design. Is that the connection?
Exactly. Modernism, particularly through what became known as the international style in the mid-20th century, took this ingrained sense of order and formalized it further.
Right, the Swiss style.
The Swiss style, precisely. The typographic grid became a fundamental tenet of this style, functioning as an orthogonal planning system that neatly parcels information into manageable chunks. The whole system assumes that by carefully controlling placement and scale relationships between elements, you significantly help the audience understand their meaning.
Like those iconic posters.
Absolutely. Think of the iconic Swiss-style posters. Clean, precise, immediately legible, all thanks to the underlying grid.
And it wasn't just practical, was it? I mean, our source mentions that early proponents, especially among the European avant-garde, almost saw it as having an explicitly spiritual quality.
They really did.
It even led to that famous split between Theo van Doesburg and Piet Mondrian over just tilting an axis 90 degrees.
Can you imagine a whole artistic fallout over an angle?
And Joseph Miller-Brockmann, the Swiss champion of the grid, defined its desire for order in almost sacred terms. It makes you wonder, why such passion for what seems like just a technical tool?
It's a crucial question, and it really speaks to the historical context. For designers emerging from two, unimaginably destructive world wars, order and clarity weren't just design principles, they became paramount societal goals. The grid offered a way to rebuild, to create a sense of control and comprehensibility in a really chaotic world.
A reaction to the chaos.
Absolutely. Imagine the feeling of trying to bring pure mathematical truth to a society in upheaval. A way to rebuild not just cities, but a sense of fundamental stability after such profound trauma. That's the kind of passion that led to splits over a single 90-degree turn.
Wow.
And beyond the philosophical, businesses quickly recognized this power too. They saw how the grid could organize their public presence, convey reliability to consumers, and directly impact their bottom lines.
So it was both utopian and practical.
Simultaneously utopian and intensely practical. Yeah.
It's fascinating, though, how a concept can be both revered and, well, reviled. Our sources reveal this fascinating paradox. For some graphic designers, the grid is just an unquestioned part of the process. It yields precision, order, clarity, joinery and furniture made. It's just inherent to the craft.
Right. Foundational.
But for others, it's symbolic of old guard aesthetic oppression, a stifling cage that hinders the search for expression. What stands out to you about this tension?
Oh, this tension is absolutely crucial and very real in the design world, even today. On one hand, the grid offers incredible efficiency.
Right.
It allows designers to rapidly lay out enormous amounts of information, saving time, saving resources. It also makes collaboration much easier, ensuring visual consistency across large projects or teams.
Okay, so clarity, efficiency, continuity. The benefits are clear.
Absolutely. Consider a designer tasked with a big corporate annual report. They'd likely embrace the grid for its trustworthiness, its systematic approach. It ensures every financial table, every corporate statement is perfectly aligned and easy to digest. You need that reliability.
But on the other hand, it can feel like a straitjacket, right? Like it's limiting creativity.
Exactly. It speaks to a deep human desire for expressive freedom, particularly as our relationship with information has changed so dramatically. Information isn't just flat on a page anymore, is it?
No, definitely not.
People expect it to move, jump, twist, make noise. So imagine that same designer, but now they're tasked with, say, an avant-garde art exhibition catalog. Here, they might feel the grid as a stifling cage. They might yearn to express the raw, unpredictable nature of the art itself, perhaps even intentionally distorting type to reflect a painting's brushstrokes or the energy of a sculpture.
So it's almost a philosophical battle playing out on the page.
It really is. Order versus chaos, structure versus spontaneity. The grid's minimal simplicity can feel utterly at odds with this kinetic, shifting surface of multimedia and the demand for more expressive forms.
That's the profound irony, isn't it? The source points out that the very corporations that embrace the grid's neutral utopian uniform to streamline their image actually helped create the oversaturated environment that is currently in demand.
Exactly. The grid's success, its ubiquity, contributed to the desire for something beyond its simplicity. People started craving difference, novelty. And this isn't just an aesthetic debate either. The design profession itself has seen a significant societal shift. Recent years have brought design thinking to the forefront, with discussions around accessibility, gender, race, other social concerns often prioritized over what some might call the purer, intrinsic relationships between form, organization, and meaning.
That's a really important point.
It is. And while those social discussions are vital, this shift sometimes overshadows the fundamental link between form making, how things look and are structured, and the visual dissemination of information. It means this simple seeming discussion of grids can, in fact, wrap in these much larger societal issues about what design is for and who it serves.
Okay, so we're convinced the grid is powerful, complex history, lots of debate around it. Now, how do you actually build one? Because our sources are very clear. Just picking an arbitrary grid is a recipe for frustration and a lot of time lost. That sounds like a designer's nightmare.
It certainly is, and this highlights a critical point. Why is pre-planning so important? The source emphasizes that once developed, the grid is essentially a closed system.
A closed system.
Okay. Meaning, a designer must account for all the content's idiosyncrasies up front, the nature of the images, the different kinds of text you'll have, their relative volumes, all that stuff.
So you have to know what's going in it before you build it.
Precisely. If you don't, you'll find yourself constantly reworking the structure, readjusting everything you've already designed, discovering new problems you didn't anticipate. It leads to significant time loss and, immense frustration. It's like trying to build a house without blueprints. You'll constantly run into structural issues.
So instead of that trial by fire approach, what are the practical suggestions for actually designing a grid effectively?
Well, our sources suggest two main practical approaches, both aiming for a grid that truly serves the content rather than forcing it into a box.
Okay.
One is to first design a few well-chosen key parts of the project, maybe a particularly difficult page spread or complex data visualization, something tricky.
Start with the hard stuff.
Yeah, exactly. By seeing the real material in action, you can then develop the grid from those observations.
This audiobook is brought to you by
This
Sunil
spontaneous
Sharma,
approach,
dedicated
as the book
designer.
calls it, aims to be well-tailored to the project's unique goals and content.
Makes sense. And the other way.
The other is to overlay transparent sketches of different layout ideas. You experiment with various arrangements, looking for corresponding alignments and proportions that seem to naturally emerge from the material itself.
Ah, like finding common ground.
Exactly. Then you construct the grid based on those findings. This allows for a composite view, helping distill the underlying structure that best fits the content. It's less about imposing and more about discovering.
Beyond just avoiding frustration, what fundamental factors should a designer consider before even putting down a single grid line? What are the absolute must-things?
Content is truly the cornerstone. It dictates so much. First, there are the physical factors.
Okay, physical.
For print, this means considering the exact sheet size, the overall proportion, the shape of the medium. Any pre-detract page counts all that heavily influences how content can be distributed.
Right, the canvas itself.
Exactly. For digital, it's about the screen size. Is it a huge desktop monitor or a tiny smartphone? Pixel resolution, and even how user view settings might affect spatial attributes. A screen displays only so much information at a time, right? So the container itself dictates a lot of initial decisions.
And the content within that container isn't uniform either. It can vary wildly, as you said.
Oh, absolutely. The source emphasizes how content can vary wildly within a single project. Think about it. One section of an annual report might have just 2 small images, 500 words of standard text, while another section is a massive 10,000-word Q&A dialogue with numerous callouts but no images at all. Or a website might have a blog post with one layout structure, an e-commerce product page with another, and a contact us page with yet another. This kind of inherent variation necessitates really careful planning up front.
And to handle that variation, the book introduces this idea of content mapping using a matrix. How does that work? It sounds useful.
It's an incredibly helpful strategic tool. Creating a matrix allows designers to map out extensive content, actively looking for best and worst case scenarios across pages, spreads, or sections.
Best and worst cases.
Yeah, you compare the smallest amount of a certain content type to the largest, or the simplest combination of elements to the most complex. For example, charting how an image-heavy spread compares to a text-heavy spread, or how a single paragraph of copy might appear versus a long list with bullet points.
I can see how that would help.
It's incredibly useful for practical planning, determining page counts for publications, building comprehensive website wireframes, even for budgeting purposes in project proposals. Ultimately, it's about understanding the functional needs of the information.
Right.
Different kinds of information images, text, data require different treatments to ensure clarity and effective communication. It's fundamentally a question of usability. How can the content be arranged and sequenced to promote clarity and understanding it intellectually, emotionally, symbolically, contextually, and practically? All those aspects inform the arrangement.
Okay, let's dig into the specifics. When it comes to building a grid, especially for text-heavy projects like books or magazines, our sources make it clear that typography is arguably the most important component. Why is that? What makes type so central?
Well, simply put, the more text there is, the more challenging it is for you, the viewer, to assimilate that information comfortably.
Makes sense. Walls of text are daunting.
Exactly. So basing a grid's attributes on the text typography becomes a crucial strategy right from the outset. The primary goal is always to make reading comfortable, which involves several key readability metrics.
Like what?
We're talking about the chosen type size, obviously, the font's color or density, which refers to how light or dark the text block appears on the page, almost like a subtle texture.
Okay, density.
And the precise spacing between individual letters, between words, and between lines. All those tiny details add up.
And has a widely accepted sweet spot for line length, isn't there? To avoid tiring the reader's eyes.
Absolutely. Our source highlights that for most readers, somewhere between 50 to 80 characters, including spaces, is optimal for a single line before you hit the return.
50 to 80 characters.
Yeah, which translates to roughly 8 to 12 words per line, depending on the language and font. This character count directly determines the ideal width of a paragraph for that specific typeface and size.
And why is that specific length so important?
Sticking to it helps reduce hyphenation, making the text flow more smoothly, and especially for justified text, it minimizes those distracting rivers of white space that can sometimes run vertically through paragraphs, pulling your eye away from the actual words. It keeps the reading path clean.
Ah, the dreaded rivers.
Yeah.
And then there's leading. Most people might think of that as just line spacing, but our source highlights a nuance. Interline space is what really matters. Can you explain that difference?
Yeah, it's a subtle but important distinction. While leading is the technical term for the measured distance from one baseline of text to the next.
Okay.
It's the interline space, the actual negative space between the lines of text that truly impacts legibility.
The white space between the lines.
Exactly. That negative space should ideally be larger than the spacing between letters and words. Why? To ensure the reader's eye moves smoothly downward from line to line without getting lost or accidentally jumping horizontally into adjacent columns, if you have them.
Right, you want lines blurring together.
Precisely. If the interline space is too tight, the lines blend together, creating a dense, impenetrable block. If it's too loose, the text feels disjointed, and the reader loses their place easily. It's a delicate balance.
So it's all about creating a harmonious visual flow, from the smallest details like letter spacing up to the biggest elements like the page margins. It sounds like a very holistic approach.
It absolutely is. This is the concept of harmonic spacing applied from micro to macro. Traditionally, for instance, margin width was often set at twice the column gutter with the 2.1 ratio.
Why that specific ratio?
To ensure that columns held together visually as a distinct unit, but were clearly separated from the edge of the page and from each other. It creates a visual breathing room that frames the content beautifully. Imagine a book where the inner margin is too tight, making the text feel cramped, almost swallowed by the spine. Or where the outer margins are so narrow that the text feels like it's about to fall off the page. Harmonic spacing prevents this visual claustrophobia.
Gotcha.
The core principle here is really profound, and the source puts it well. Material that is contiguous or more closely related in meaning should be closer together, and information that is not contiguous or unrelated in meaning should be further apart.
Simple but powerful.
Totally. This logic applies at every level, from the tightest spacing between letters in a word to the generous separation provided by margins. You incrementally increase spacing proportions to distinguish between typographic components and create a clear visual hierarchy.
And once you've figured out your typography, the size, leading, line length,
Yeah.
how do you practically build the columns and rows of the grid itself? It sounds like it requires some precise measurements.
It absolutely does. It gets quite technical. First, for the column structure, you base the column, gutter the space between columns on the running text requirements you've just established.
Right, avoiding eye jump.
Exactly. Making sure the reader's eye doesn't jump horizontally and the line length is optimal within the column. Once you know your ideal column width and gutter width, you determine how many columns will comfortably fit within your page format.
Okay.
The remaining spaces on either side then naturally form your outer and inner margins.
Got it. And rows, especially for modular grids.
For the row structure, especially in modular grids where you have horizontal divisions too, you define depth intervals from the top to the bottom of the page. A key decision here is whether baselines of text in adjacent columns will align perfectly across the page.
The baseline grid.
Exactly, the baseline grid. If they do, you specify a common leading increment that all text styles will lock to, ensuring absolute vertical precision. This often requires some specific math to make sure those baseline guides land precisely on row guides, row gutter guides, and foot margin guides. It allows text to flow seamlessly while respecting those horizontal divisions. It's all about creating an underlying scaffold that the text can comfortably rest upon.
So that's for text-heavy projects.
This
But what if
audiobook
imagery
is
is
brought
the
to you by
main
Sunil
focus,
Sharma,
like in a large format
dedicated
poster or a
designer.
coffee table book full of photos? This raises an important question. How does the grid adapt then? Do you still start with type?
Not necessarily, no. In those cases, the grid structure can actually be based primarily on the image proportions themselves.
Okay. Based on the pictures.
Yeah. If all the images, or the most important ones, conform to the same aspect ratio, meaning they have the same width to height relationship, like a perfect square or a classic 3.2 photograph, then this ratio can define a fundamental module. You then build your columns and rows from that module shape.
Totally.
It is. And when images are placed on this grid, they can be scaled to sizes defined by fields of these modules. And surprisingly, even typographic elements will often end up sharing the same proportional logic, making them feel intrinsically well related to the images. It creates a seamless visual language where images and text are in perfect harmony.
That's a really clever way to ensure visual harmony, especially when visuals are dominant. Does our source give a classic example of this strategy, something people might recognize?
It does. It mentions Joseph Miller Brockman, again,
Right.
the Swiss grid champion we talked about earlier.
Right.
He created an iconic poster where the grid was based entirely on the proportional aspect ratio of a film still.
The film still. Wow.
Yeah. The module itself was designed to be the size and shape of one frame of film. And you can even see how the row gutters, the spaces between the rows, were intentionally made deeper than the column gutters.
Why deeper?
To maintain a kind of cinematic storyboard-like flow, it allowed captions to appear below the images rather than squeezed in beside them, just like you might see in a movie script or storyboard. It's a beautiful example of form following the content's inherent visual rhythm.
That's fantastic. And this strategy sounds incredibly flexible too, allowing for consistency across different applications like a whole campaign.
It is. This approach allows for incredibly high flexibility and scalability. You can take that base module derived from the image proportion and scale it up or down for different formats, a massive poster, a detailed book, even an entire branding campaign across multiple mediums.
So the same logic works everywhere.
Pretty much. You can add or remove columns and rows depending on the format's specific proportion, or even scale the entire module group down for a detailed book, or scale it way up for a bolder, more simplified expression on a large billboard. It ensures a cohesive visual identity regardless of the size or platform.
But what about when images have different aspect ratios? That must be a common challenge, especially when you're dealing with a variety of sourced images, like in a magazine or catalog.
It is a very common challenge, and it requires a more nuanced approach, especially in projects like exhibition catalogs where cropping images often isn't permitted because you need to show the full artwork, right?
Right, you can't just cut off part of a painting.
Exactly. In such cases, designers are advised to make the images transparent, digitally speaking, then shift and resize them, comparing their relative aspect ratios to find proportional relationships at different scales.
So layering them up and looking for overlaps.
Kind of, yeah. It's an iterative process. It allows them to distill a base module that can form the basis of a cohesive column and row structure, even with disparate image formats. It's about finding those hidden correlations, those underlying visual harmonies that might not be immediately obvious. It allows the designer to create a system that can accommodate visual variety without devolving into chaos.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. In today's multi-device, multi-screen world, how do grids adapt? Do they even apply in responsive design where layouts are constantly shifting depending on screen size?
Oh, absolutely. Grids are not only applicable, but absolutely crucial for UX design, user experience design.
Crucial. Why so much?
Because their inherent modularity makes them ideal for adapting online communications to vastly different screen sizes, from that huge desktop monitor down to a tiny smartphone screen. They provide the underlying structure that allows for flexible systems, ensuring content is readable and navigable no matter the device. Think of it like a liquid. The grid provides the container, and the content flows to fill it appropriately for each screen size.
But there must be significant challenges in maintaining that structure and visual integrity across so many variations in screen size and orientation. It sounds tricky.
There definitely are. Our source highlights two main challenges. First, maintaining structural integrity across symmetry and asymmetry. This often manifests as annoying misalignments between navigational elements and content elements when the browser resizes.
Yeah, when things get jumbled.
Exactly. On a large desktop, you might have 3 neat columns of content and a navigation bar tucked to the left. But when that shrinks to a phone, how do those 3 columns reflow? Does the navigation bar collapse into a hamburger menu? If it's not carefully planned, what was once a clean layout can become a jumbled mess where text overlaps images or navigation buttons are impossible to tap accurately. That directly hurts usability and, frankly, brand perception.
Yeah, frustrating for the user.
Totally. Second, there's the challenge of different uses of space, which can be problematic if specific layout gestures or arrangements are intrinsic to a brand's visual identity.
What do you mean by layout gestures?
Well, for example, material arranged in nice wide columns on large screens must somehow seamlessly reorient as a single column vertical scroll on smartphones. That's a dramatic shift in compositional emphasis, as the book puts it.
Huge shift.
It is. To ensure continuity and prevent a disunified branded experience, designers must build strong horizontal breaks and alignments into the large format presentation that will somehow carry through meaningfully to the small format. It's about anticipating how the content will reflow and ensuring visual consistency and an intuitive user experience at every single stage.
Okay, so you've painstakingly built a grid, accounted for content, thought about responsiveness. What's next? Our sources say the real work begins with establishing how the material will be articulated within the grid. What does that mean? It sounds like it's more than just filling in the blanks.
It's precisely that. It's about how a designer chooses to express the grid, not just how they construct it. The grid is the skeleton. Articulation is the skin and muscle, how it actually looks and feels. One of the first considerations is how full the compositional space ought to appear. This isn't just about cramming information in, it's about deliberately leaving columns or modules open, allowing for areas of emptiness, of negative space.
White space.
Exactly. Not explicitly revealing the grid structure at every single juncture. This creates a more dynamic experience and, crucially, provides areas of visual rest for you, the viewer, preventing information overload. It's not just about filling space, but orchestrating emptiness as a key design element.
So this articulation impacts how we perceive the space itself, whether it feels flat or deep. It's a subtle but powerful effect.
It absolutely does, and this raises an important question. How exactly does grid articulation affect our perception of space?
Yeah.
Well, a fuller page with more explicit alignments and elements that are similar in scale, especially large amounts of linear text like a dense block of prose, tends to lead to a flatter, more surface-focused appearance.
Very flatter.
Yeah, the text being linear and textural is felt more as a consistent surface activity, almost like a uniform carpet of information spread out.
I see. And deeper.
Conversely, leaving more columns, rows, or modules open, having greater variety in those negative spaces, and using strong contrast and element sizes big versus small all contribute to creating a deeper space. In these cases, elements can feel like independent floating objects, almost as if they exist on different planes within the layout, inviting your eye to move in and out of the page, not just across it.
How do designers keep a grid from looking static or repetitive then? Because a grid, by its very nature, implies regularity, order. How do you inject life into that structure?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is where rhythm and movement come into play, and it's a key part of grid articulation. Designers use strategic variation to actively prevent uniformity and inject dynamism.
Strategic variations are like what?
Simple tricks include alternately clustering images toward the top or bottom from spread to spread in a book, or forcing a mix of small, medium, and large images onto a spread, and then varying their positions on subsequent spreads. These basic strategies create what our source terms bounce from spread to spread.
Bounce, I like that.
Yeah, it keeps the layout dynamic and engaging. A strong hang line, for instance, that's a consistent horizontal alignment point for elements across a page,
Okay.
can establish a consistent visual rest area that powerfully contrasts with the vertical rhythms of text columns and images, adding to that dynamic flow and preventing monotony. It's about setting up expectations and then playing with them.
This might sound counterintuitive, but our source explicitly states that a grid is successfully implemented only if a designer rises above the uniformity implied by its structure. It actually says, grids don't make dull layouts, designers do. It's almost like the rules are meant to be bent or even broken
This
sometimes.
audiobook is brought
Precisely,
to you by
that's a
Sunil
key
Sharma,
takeaway. The
dedicated
core message
designer.
here is that a grid system exists to encourage flexibility, not to impose rigidity. Its rules are meant to allow a wide range of expression. The grid is a guide to be followed as much as possible, but deviated from if there's a good reason to do so.
If there's a good reason.
Exactly. It's about thoughtful violation, not thoughtless abandonment. It's about knowing the rules so well that you understand when and how to break them effectively to enhance the message or the aesthetic experience. You break them with purpose.
Can you give us some examples of this intentional violation from the source material? How do designers rise above uniformity in practice?
Certainly. One striking example is from a Sichuan cookbook mentioned in the book.
Okay.
There's a gold-hued call-out box set in a very different font, an italic neoclassical serif that completely ignores the established grid's alignment and width proportions. It just floats freely on the page.
So it pops out.
Totally. It creates a visually striking contrast with the otherwise geometric and precise material around it. It's an immediate focal point, drawing your eye precisely because it breaks the rule. Another part of that same cookbook has a chapter opening arranged symmetrically, which stands in deliberate contrast to the asymmetrical arrangements found elsewhere in the book.
So using symmetry as the violation.
Exactly. It creates a sense of surprise and intentional variation, guiding the viewer's journey and signaling something dissonant is happening.
So it's about creating tension, a deliberate visual disruption for emphasis or change of pace.
Exactly that. Another fascinating example is a publication where elements like images and text are purposefully designed to cross gutters, push outside the true margins, and intrude into the text fields.
Wow, really breaking boundaries.
Literally. The underlying structure was specifically designed to accommodate this transgressive behavior. The grid is still there, but it's set up to allow elements to burst beyond its confines, creating a dynamic, almost rebellious feel. Or consider a poster using an 8-column modular grid that's expressed conventionally at the bottom, but transforms into a kind of concentric frame set above. And it's further violated by diagonal channels cutting through it and irregular illustrative forms overlapping. It demonstrates multiple levels of intentional grid breaking within a single piece. These violations aren't random. They are conscious, strategic design choices that add dynamism, emphasize specific content, and orchestrate the viewer's eye in unexpected ways.
Building on that idea of variation, what about the overall timing or cadence of a visual experience, like in a book or a long website scroll? Does the grid influence how a viewer moves through a project over time?
It absolutely does. The rhythmic pacing of a visual presentation from one part of a system to another, especially in sequence-based formats like books, magazines, or websites, is a powerful means of keeping the grid's implementation lively and engaging.
Pacing, like musical rhythm.
Kind of, yeah. Pacing can be understood as a cadence or timing that you, the viewer, will apprehend as you move through. By varying this rhythm, maybe going from slow, deliberate spreads to fast, dynamic ones, or from quiet, minimal pages to visually dense, active ones, the designer achieves several goals.
What kind of goals?
Visually, each new screen or page spread engages you in a fresh way, preventing visual fatigue. Informationally, it can cue you to significant content changes, clarifying function and guiding your attention, like a change in tempo signaling a new movement.
So ordering content is about function, making sure it makes sense. But pacing is about feeling.
That's a perfect way to put it. The ordering process accounts for the location and actual sequence of the raw content, making sure the narrative or information flow is logical. Pacing, however, is concerned with the formal variation imposed upon that content, how it's presented. Ordering is functional. Pacing is emotional. It's about orchestrating your journey through the material, creating a compelling visual narrative that unfolds over time. It can build anticipation, create moments of calm, or deliver impactful bursts of information, all through visual rhythm.
Our sources even describe kinetic structures, where visual elements relate in time, almost like film frames. How does that translate in a static medium like print, or even a digital one like a website? It sounds very dynamic.
Indeed. In print, this might involve images that subtly move or change from page to page, affecting subsequent elements, creating a sense of progression as you flip through a book.
Like a flipbook effect, almost.
A sophisticated version of that, yeah.
Yeah.
Think of a series of photographs where a figure slowly moves across the frame from one page to the next, almost like stop-motion animation. In digital, this is even more explicit, of course.
Yeah.
Think of a digital annual report where, as you scroll, images don't just appear, but perhaps slide in from the side. Or textual elements subtly shift their weight or position, revealing layers of information. It's not just about content changing, but the way it changes becoming part of the story.
Right, the animation itself adds meaning.
Exactly. It creates a sense of unfolding narrative as you interact. This kinetic structure is understood as you experience the succession of frames or screens. Using these sensory experiences of space and time as organizing principles can powerfully evoke a visceral emotional response from you, the viewer. This is when the layout itself becomes part of the narrative, actively contributing to the message, not just containing it.
It feels like for a long time, the design industry, especially after modernism, seemed almost obsessed with rationalism, with order.
The international style certainly dominated.
But our sources highlight this fascinating counter-movement, exploring the absurd and primal. It's like a design rebellion, a deliberate push against that established order. Where did that come from?
It truly is a rebellion, and its roots are actually quite deep. You can trace it back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The devastation of mechanized warfare in World War I, coupled with Sigmund Freud's publications on the human psyche and the subconscious, fueled an exploration of the absurd and the primal in art and design. Think of Art Nouveau's sensual plant forms reacting against the coldness of the machine age, or the raw, expressive texture of letters and backgrounds in later movements like Dada and Futurism. These were already challenging conventional notions of order and beauty long before the grid became dogma.
So the Bauhaus, often seen as the pinnacle of rationalism, wasn't the only story in that early 20th century design world.
Not at all. It's a common misconception. While Zurich designers, particularly those associated with the later international style, pursued a very rational intellectualism, prioritizing typography and strict grid systems, designers in Basel, influenced more by humanism, focused more on symbolic form and optical qualities rather than pure structure. This Basel approach would actually play a significant role in the eventual shift away from strict grid-based designs later on.
Interesting.
And even within the Netherlands, you had designers like Piet Zwart, who blended symbolist approaches with the purity of Distill and the dynamism of Dada and Futurism, walking this fascinating line between structural and intuitive organization. It was a really rich tapestry of thought, not just one single monolithic approach.
And then came Wolfgang Weingart, who the source describes as a pivotal figure in this counter-movement. What made his work so impactful?
Weingart, who taught at the Basel School, is often credited with introducing deconstruction into the rational aesthetic of structuralist graphic design. Yeah, he wasn't just abandoning the grid, he was actively taking it apart, twisting it, layering it, reassembling it in new, surprising ways. His experiments with typographic scale, overlapping forms, unexpected angles, pushing the limits of printing technology, coupled with his profound interaction with students, really influenced a whole new generation of designers. By the mid-1960s, the international style was pretty entrenched globally. It was the establishment.
Right.
But a younger design community, perhaps still recovering from the psychological aftermath of WWII and looking for more meaning, grew increasingly critical of its sometimes reductive, almost sterile aesthetic. They were pushing for new, more expressive and emotionally resonant forms. Weingart gave them tools and permission.
And the digital revolution seems to have been the true catalyst for this paradigm shift. really opening the floodgates for breaking the grid in mainstream design. David Carson, famously a surfer and sociologist, really
This
epitomized
audiobook
this
is
shift,
brought to
didn't he?
you by
He
Sunil
absolutely
Sharma,
did. The
dedicated
shift
designer.
to digital editing and desktop publishing opened up possibilities that had been unimaginable, or at least incredibly difficult and expensive, with traditional typesetting and paste-up methods.
Right, the computer changed everything.
Completely. Carson, coming to design from working at a surf magazine, Raygun, famously created these unstudied layouts that relied much more on an intuitive sense of placement.
Unstudied?
Yeah, his work was often more about interpreting the experience of the content with the raw energy of surfing or alternative music. For example, not rationally or impartially organizing it in the traditional sense. He used the extensive typesetting capabilities of the computer to explore typographic arrangements and effects, like layering text or extreme distortion, that had previously been technically almost impossible.
And it was controversial, but influential.
Hugely influential. It showed that this unconventional energy could be incredibly powerful and communicative, even if it defied conventional logic and legibility rules. And others, like the British studio Why Not Associates, were also violating conventional ideas about structure around the same time, favoring organization that reflected ideas about time, film, and the expanding world of digital interactivity.
So it's safe to say that experientially driven presentation has gained immense importance in modern design. It's not just about grids anymore.
Yes, profoundly so. Designers now have this incredibly rich toolkit where intuitive and idiosyncratic approaches stand on equal terms with rational approaches, as the book says. Interactive media, in particular, has fundamentally changed how people access and process information, making these flexible, expressive methods increasingly viable and often more user-centric. The emphasis has shifted from simply delivering information clearly to crafting an immersive, memorable experience for the viewer.
So if not a traditional orthogonal grid, then what? Our sources suggest designers need not totally discard the notion of structure, but should explore alternative kinds. What does that look like in practice? How do you structure something without a grid?
This is where designers truly get creative, moving beyond those strict 90-degree axes. One major possibility is deconstruction, which basically means taking apart or subverting a traditional grid to generate entirely new spatial relationships. It's not chaos, it's an intentional reordering, using the grid's logic against itself, in a way.
How do you deconstruct a grid? That sounds like a contradiction in terms.
Well, you can do it through techniques the book calls splitting, splicing, and shifting.
Okay.
This involves manipulating a base grid along its original orthogonal axis, but doing it irregularly. You might separate elements at uneven intervals, or cut and slide parts of the layout horizontally or vertically, or maybe widen some columns and rows but not others.
So introducing deliberate breaks and shifts.
Exactly. Imagine a perfectly ordered block of text, then suddenly one column widens unexpectedly, or a paragraph is cut mid-sentence and shifted slightly upwards. This creates dynamic vertical substructures and a sense of visual movement, making the layout feel more energetic and less predictable than a standard grid.
And then there's deformation and distortion. That sounds even more radical, almost like the grid is melting or bending.
It kind of is. This involves altering the actual shapes of the columns and rows themselves, pulling their edges out of parallel alignment to emphasize diagonal axes instead of just horizontal and vertical ones.
So tilted lines, curves.
Yeah, exactly. This produces a much more organic compositional effect, where the underlying orthogonal grid becomes far less apparent, maybe even disappears visually. Instead of perfectly straight lines, imagine the columns of text subtly curving or tilting, creating a sense that they're receding into the page or even leaning forward towards you. It's like the page itself is bending or twisting, making elements appear to overlap in a more fluid, almost three-dimensional way. It breaks free from the flatness of a typical layout and can create the illusion of perspective.
Beyond just messing with the grid itself, our sources talk about conceptual approaches, where the meaning of the content itself becomes the structure. How does that work? That's a really fascinating idea.
This is truly innovative, where the content directly informs the form in a conceptual way. One way is using what the book calls verbal or conceptual cues.
Okay.
For instance, the natural rhythm of spoken language could guide changes in a typeface's weight, size, color, or alignment. Louder or maybe faster words might be set larger or bolder or placed in a different position on the page, breaking the line.
Giving a voice to the words visually.
Exactly. It gives a voice to visual language, pushing words out of neat paragraphs or forcing columns into relationships where the writing's natural logic, its inherent rhythm, creates the visual order. Our source even mentions a book where character dialogue is coded by typeface style.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, maybe one character's lines are in a bold, assertive font, another's in a light, hesitant one. And the layout deconstructs conventional columns to visually reflect interruptions or confusion in their conversation. The book argues this can sometimes even improve readability by engaging readers more deeply and emotionally with the text.
So the layout literally tells the story visually, reinforcing the narrative beyond just the words.
Exactly. And this leads directly to what the source calls narrative pictorialization.
Narrative pictorialization.
Yeah, where an idea embedded in the content is visualized as a compositional structure. The layout literally looks like something discussed in the text, perhaps creating the impression of objects swept up in a flood, with text cascading downwards irregularly, or forming a literal image of a car, with text and images arranged carefully to suggest its shape. The layout itself becomes an illustrative element, enhancing the narrative and adding another layer of meaning. It's a powerful way to merge form and content seamlessly.
And then there's vernacularism.
Oh.
I love this idea. It feels very real world, pulling from everyday life.
Vernacularism is great. It's about appropriating visual language from common everyday experiences or maybe low culture and elevating it, or at least recontextualizing it, into a design context.
Like pop art.
Exactly like pop art. Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes or soup cans are prime examples, taking mundane commercial imagery and putting it in a fine art gallery. In design, it might be like designing an invitation for an exclusive high-end art auction, but using the aesthetics of a cheap supermarket ad flyer.
Oh.
Maybe using bold, utilitarian typefaces, bright primary colors, maybe even fake price tags. This approach embeds it in this new context, either to draw a comparison or possibly to comment on the subject, creating a powerful, often surprising, and culturally resonant visual statement. It can be humorous, ironic, or deeply insightful, depending on how it's used.
What about more intuitive approaches, like relying on spontaneity or chance? That truly sounds like the absolute opposite of a rigid grid. How can that possibly lead to organized or effective design?
It might seem that way, but it can be incredibly effective, especially when handled by a skilled designer with a good eye. Spontaneous optical composition is one method.
Spontaneous optical composition.
It involves placing material based purely
This
on its formal
audiobook is brought
aspects,
to you
shape,
by Sunil
color,
Sharma,
texture, weight,
dedicated
discerning
designer.
inherent visual relationships on the fly, much like a painter makes quick decisions about color and brushstroke without necessarily having a pre-drawn grid.
So trusting your eye.
Exactly, trusting your intuition. This doesn't mean chaos. When done well, it can result in complex information in a quiet, lyrical rhythm that is easily digestible, because the designer is following an intuitive sense of balance, flow, and hierarchy. It's about feeling the right placement rather than calculating it based on grid lines.
So the visuals themselves can actually lead the design rather than text structure or an underlying grid.
Yes, that's what the source calls imagery as primary inspiration. Images often have a much broader range of form languages, shapes, textures, implied movements, depth than typography alone, which tends to be more linear and structured. Allowing the visual aspects of imagery to rule the compositional structure and even letting them influence typographic attributes like scale or placement can quickly relieve a designer of presumptions about how text should behave. It forces designers to think outside the typical text block box and allows the unique qualities of the visuals to dictate the overall layout, often leading to really fresh and unexpected solutions.
And chance operations. That truly sounds like throwing caution to the wind. How does that work in a controlled design environment where you usually need predictable results?
Yeah, it sounds risky, but it's really about controlled unpredictability. There are two main categories our source discusses. The first is random physical action, like literally flinging paint at a surface and using the resulting splatters as a background texture, or maybe scattering cropped images randomly across a page and then designing around their haphazard arrangement. While you can't predict the exact outcome of each individual action, you understand the type of patterns or effects that will result. This is useful for communicating concepts like motion, the unpredictability of nature, or absurdity.
Right, embracing the randomness.
Exactly. The second is programmatic effect, which uses planned mechanical or mathematical procedures to introduce chance. For example, dissecting an image based on an arbitrary grid or formula you set up beforehand, or using an algorithm to randomly generate type sizes or positions within certain parameters.
So setting up a system for chance.
Precisely. This also denies explicit moment-to-moment human control over every detail, but guarantees more foreknowledge of the general results. It creates unexpected yet structured outcomes. It's a fascinating blend of rigid rules and spontaneous, unpredictable output.
When you break the grid using any of these methods, does everything just become a free-for-all? How would designers maintain clarity and ensure the viewer can still understand what they're seeing, especially when moving away from that traditional predictable order?
That's a critical point, and no, it definitely shouldn't become a free-for-all. All the fundamental principles of constructing a clear hierarchy that you'd use in a grid-based layout still apply, even when you're using an alternative, more fluid approach.
So hierarchy is still key.
Absolutely. There's no reason an unusual or expressive composition can't also be a friendly and navigable one. The two aspects that deserve the most attention and often cause navigation trouble in unusual layouts, if not handled well, are optical differentiation and eye path, or compositional flow.
Okay, optical differentiation and eye path. Explain those.
Optical differentiation is just about making sure the most important elements clearly stand out and that related elements look related. Ensuring you can easily identify the most important information, or where a sequence begins, is paramount. Focal points, which draw the eye first, are created by strong contrasts. Contrast in size, spacing, density, color, or hue.
Making things pop.
Exactly. Your eye naturally moves from areas of greatest contrast to least, so designers use this to guide your gaze. Repetition of similar visual elements also helps you understand what's related, regardless of its position on the page. Compositional flow, or eye path, is simply how your eye travels through the design. Designers support this by positioning strong axes, even diagonal ones, or using graphical forms, arrows, or even subtle visual cues like gaze direction in photos to point the way through the information.
What about really rigid elements like data, infographics, or tables? They seem inherently grid-like.
Yeah.
How do you integrate them into non-grid layouts without compromising their integrity or readability?
That's a good question. Even those inherently structured elements can be integrated into non-grid layouts without necessarily compromising their clarity or integrity. A designer might alter their overall shape, perhaps making a tables containing border wavy instead of rectangular, or rotating an infographic slightly off-axis.
Softening the edges.
Exactly, or positioning them over more organic forms in the background to diminish the visual presence of their hard corners and orthogonal axes. The data itself remains clear and readable, but its presentation feels more dynamic and visually integrated into the overall expressive layout. It's about softening their hard edges without blurring their essential meaning.
It sounds like even with all this creative freedom, breaking rules and using chance, there still needs to be some underlying system, some rules, even if they're unconventional ones. How do you systematize the organic? That's a fascinating contradiction.
It is a fascinating challenge, isn't it? How do you maintain consistency across a project, especially a large one, without compromising that unconventional energy or intuitive feel? The trick, according to the source, is to analyze the prevalent formal conditions of your content by asking simple questions. What kind of images are you using primarily? Is geometry important to their meaning or structure? Is there a sense of spatial depth implied in the visuals or the concept? Do you sense movement? And if so, what kind of movement? Is it a smooth flow or a jagged disruption?
Okay, analyzing the core visual language.
Precisely. The answers to these questions, the book says, are the system's rules. You then limit these self-imposed rules to maybe just 2 or 3 key principles, perhaps with some controlled variables. For example, if a rule is that all primary images are cropped into an irregular trapezoid shape, you might then define a variable. Are all trapezoids the same size, or can they vary within a certain defined range? Consistency in applying these few self-defined rules is paramount. If discrepancies arise later in the project, you reinvestigate the rules or create new ones to resolve them, always striving for that balance between expressive freedom and a discernible underlying logic that holds the whole thing together.
And finally, bringing it back to our constantly connected multi-device world. What about grids or lack thereof in screen-based interactivity, especially with responsive design? We touched on the challenges for standard grids, but how do these alternative rule-breaking approaches fare there?
It's a really interesting area. Digital media offers immense potential for alternative layouts, right? With Dynamic content, immersive experiences, effects like parallax scrolling where background and foreground move at different rates.
Yeah.
It almost seems ready-made for more fluid, less rigid approaches because content can move and adapt so readily.
Yeah, it feels like a natural fit.
It does. However, the small smartphone screen can sometimes be a significant hindrance for complex, unusual layouts. They often require larger viewing areas to be fully appreciated for all the nuances to come across.
Why it gets too cramped.
Exactly. And this prompts a critical question the source raises. Simply because one can design for device responsiveness, should one always?
Good question.
Is it truly important for all online content to be perfectly accessible and identically experienced on phones, especially if the complexity and nuance of the design suffers significantly in that translation? Sometimes, perhaps, a rich desktop-only experience might be more effective for certain complex or highly visual projects. It's a trade-off to consider.
That's a really great point. It's not always a one-size-fits-all solution. So what are the best practices for alternative screen-based designs then? Do they differ greatly from conventional grid-based ones when it comes to digital media fundamentals?
Not significantly in their fundamental goals, actually. The core best practices remain remarkably consistent. You still need content primacy, meaning the information itself is the most important element, dictating the design choices. Clear navigation that is distinct from the content, so users never get lost, no matter how unconventional the layout. Absolute legibility of text is still crucial, regardless of stylistic choices. Intuitive functionality and page flow, so users can easily navigate and interact without confusion. Quick loading times, always critical for user retention online. And crucially, it must still be a beautiful, compelling experience worthy of the viewer's time and attention.
So the core goals of good design endure.
Absolutely. Regardless of whether you're strictly adhering to a grid or thoughtfully breaking every rule to create something new and expressive, it's always about serving the content and the user, first and foremost.
Wow. What an incredible journey we've taken today. We've really peeled back the layers of graphic design, haven't we? From the invisible scaffolding of grids that brings profound order and efficiency, to the bold, rule-breaking innovations that inject dynamism and personality. We've seen how structure has evolved from ancient spiritual practices to become this crucial tool for organizing complex modern information.
And how designers deliberately bend, break, and sometimes completely rebuild systems to create truly compelling visual experiences. From the absolute precision of Joseph Mueller Brockman to the intuitive rebellion of David Carson, we've kind of explored the entire spectrum today.
We really have.
And this raises an important question, I think, for anyone listening. Now that you've explored this interplay between strict order and fluid expression in visual design, what new ways of organizing information might you imagine? Ways that could perhaps blend both that satisfying precision and the power of the unexpected.
Yeah. Whether it's a meticulously crafted book you pick up, a highly responsive website you browse, or an avant-garde poster that catches your eye, understanding the conscious choices designers make about order, or deliberately breaking from it, completely changes how you see the visual world around you.
It really does open your eyes.
So think about the unspoken rules that govern the spaces you inhabit daily. Your home layout, your commute route, your digital screens. How are they structured, either explicitly or implicitly? And what might happen if those structures were subtly or perhaps dramatically reimagined? Consider the silent architects of our visual lives, the grids and the systems, and think about how altering just one underlying principle might spark an entirely new way of seeing, a new way of experiencing information.